Hello, I'm Steve Maskery and welcome to Workshop Essentials. This is my table saw, and like all table saws, it's got a great big hole in the middle. And that's necessary so that you can get your hand in there when you're changing a blade. But obviously we can't use the saw like this, so we have something called a throat plate, which drops in there to fill the gap when we're using the saw. But this throat plate, just like most saw plates, does not fill the hole completely. There is a little tiny gap down here between the blade and the throat plate, and a similar one behind it on this side. And most of the time that isn't a problem. But if we're cutting a piece so there's a very slight sliver being cut off, then that can get jammed down there. And if that sliver happens to be wedge-shaped, then if it goes down as a wedge, it can damage the blade by pushing it over to one side. It can spoil your workpiece. And we don't want things going wrong when we're using a table saw, do we? No, we do not. There is another problem with using a standard throat plate with this gap around the blade, and that is when we're cutting fragile materials like this. This is a chipboard, we call it, particle board you might know it as, and it's got a melamine surface, a sort of very thin layer of plastic. And that's quite fragile when it comes to cutting it. So I'm going to make a cut, and you can see what sort of quality of cut we get with this is a thin curve combination blade actually, so it's not a specialist blade for melamine, but we're using the ordinary standard throat plate that came with the saw. So we'll just pull this over, and we'll make a cut about, oh, I don't know, about there. Eyes and ears. Right, now if we look at this, on the top it's really very nice on the top, but if we turn it over, yeah, not so good, quite raggedy at the edges and a little bit of chip right at the very end. That's nowhere near as good as what we want if we're going to do fine quality work even on cheap and nasty materials like MFC. So we can improve on that. This is a zero clearance insert. Well, it's not now, it was when I made it. It's worn out. And this replaces the throat plate. So that goes in. And when this was made, there was no gap at all between the edge of the blade and the edge of the slot for the blade. Zero clearance. And when the blade is high, it's zero clearance at the sides and at this very front edge as well. When you lower the blade for a different cut, the sides stay zero clearance, but the front doesn't. So these constantly wear and have to be replaced fairly regularly. I've had this in for far too long. The other way in which they wear is because of abrasion. Now, wood, sawdust, is abrasive material. And all these gullets carry that sawdust away. So when it's been through the wood, these gullets are full of sawdust. And they're constantly rubbing against the sides of the slot for the kerf. And so slowly and slowly, this kerf gets bigger and bigger and bigger, wider and wider at this end of the slot. And you can see that it's much narrower at that end than it is at this end. So this is called a zero clearance insert, and we're going to make some. I suggest you don't just make one, make a batch, because you can swap them. If you've always got one on the shelf or in the cupboard, you can swap one as soon as it starts to lose its zero clearance properties. So let's talk about the material. Now this is, it looks to me, 16 millimetre MDF. MDF isn't that strong when it gets thin like this, and you can see that I've lost a big chunk from underneath in some time. But it's good in other respects. It's flat and it doesn't splinter. It's not going to explode on me. You certainly don't want to be doing this, making one of these out of, say, acrylic. Also, I wouldn't use solid wood because that can splinter. If something happens, if it's solid wood, it can split and then who knows. So I suggest either MDF like this or plywood, because plywood's not going to shatter either. And for this job, I've got some plywood. So the first thing to do then is to cut some blanks which are going to fit this space. And to do that, we're going to use our original as a template. This is what I've got for my material. It's 1/2" ply, Far Eastern ply. It's not great quality, actually. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but it's not great. I would have preferred Baltic birch ply, but that is very expensive, and he'd got no offcuts at all at the timber yard. It was a full sheet or nothing, whereas this was a 1/4 sheet, which I picked up for a £5. So, you know, it's cheap enough. But there are voids in it. It's when you look at the way that the veneers, they overlap, they're sort of squashed in, and there are voids, and it's not very nice. But it's good enough for this job. I made them just very slightly oversized for my throat plate. Now, throat plates, there are two basic designs for a throat plate. There's one where there's a slot that the blade comes up through, and the throat plate, the metal of the throat plate does go all the way around. And there's this sort that I've got on mine, where you've got a recess in the side, if you like, a one-sided slot, if you want to think of it like that. This is a bit more difficult to deal with, to be honest, because what you're left with when you've got your blade come through is a very narrow and therefore quite fragile piece on this side. And as you can see, I've lost some of it underneath anyway. It's not that strong. So to get that, we have to start by making our piece of plywood fit that space perfectly. And so we're going to use this as a template, some double-sided tape. Not too much, otherwise you'll never get it off. There must be a better technique than this for peeling off the second side of the tape. Oh, for goodness sake. Finally. And I want to register, now I've got a face edge on this, it's there, and I want to register that against this imaginary edge of the slot. So that goes on there like that, upright, both firmly against the table, and then pressed together. And so that's my edge that's going to go against this edge of the throat, and the rest I can trim up on my router table.
Not so fast, Steve. You've got to balance all the corners off first.
I'm going to copy the shape of this steel throat plate exactly by using it as a template and using a flush trim bit like this. Now, this is a cheap and nasty one. This cost pennies, I think, out of a junk tray at a sale. And I don't want to risk one of my good quality ones just in case anything nasty happens. It shouldn't do, but steel and rotating cutters aren't a good mix. So this is a 1/4" one. I'm actually going to use a 1/2" one that I've got set up in there. But when you look at these, there is the cutting edge and there is the bearing. And they line up exactly. But between the two, there is a washer. And that means that there is a gap. And we're going to use that gap to ensure that we don't have any nasty accidents. Because the interface between the steel and the plywood is going to be set at exactly somewhere in that little tiny gap, so that the bearing is entirely on the steel and the cutter is entirely on the wood. And it does mean that I'll have a little tiny bit of waste between the two that I'm going to have to remove in a second pass, but that's easy to do. But I don't want the cutter to go as far as the steel, and I don't want the bearing to go onto the wood, otherwise nothing will get cut. So we are going to move in an anti-clockwise manner, so I need to start at that corner and go all the way around and finish at that corner. Obviously, I'm going to leave this edge intact. I'm not going to follow my steel into that recess. That would rather defeat the object, wouldn't it? So we're going to start there, and we'll see what happens. Right, well, we just prise this off. There we go. Get rid of that for a minute. So I've got 4 pieces that are the right size, but this top edge is really raggedy. So I'm going to drop my cutter a little bit. Well, do I need to? Yes, I need to drop it a little bit and use the new cut edge as the template for that raggedy bit that's left over. There we go, that should do. That should do. And so now with the raggedy edge at the top, no, the raggedy edge at the bottom against the table, that should clean up nicely. Now that is much better, much better. So now it's over to the drill press to drill a couple of finger holes. So I've got my blanks with a finger hole so that I can lift them out if they're a bit tight. They're not, as it happens, but it's a good idea to drill the finger holes before you find that you need them. And you'll see that they won't actually sit properly yet. They won't quite go in there. And that's because the top of the blade is still higher up than the underside of this. And I can't really drop it in while the blade's running. It's just, I haven't got enough control for that. So this is what we do. The object of this exercise is to cut 2 slots there and there. And that is going to leave enough space for the riving knife as well as the blade to come up when we actually calibrate this for zero clearance. So we take one of our pieces and we put them flush with the inside like that and move the fence right up to it. Like that. And that should feel nice and flush the fence and the inside edge of the throat. And it does, good. The original throat plate goes back. And I can't use my SuperGuard because the fence is too close to the blade. So I've got my magnetic one. Which can sit like that. and that doesn't move anywhere. And it goes in, turn round, goes in like that. And we need to go just over halfway. Like that. And now all I've got to do is to fit a very thin fillet of wood to close the ends up.
If you'd like to see how I make a sliver of wood which fits a saw curve exactly, check out my video about making spline miter joints for boxes. It's all in there.
So now I've got my glued up throat plate with the end cleaned up nicely, and it sits in there like that. And that sits nice and snugly. Perfect fit, doesn't wobble, isn't jammed solid. And these two fit nicely as well. This one got something not quite right here. I suspect I'd not got it lined up properly with the edge of the templates, because when that goes in, there's just a little tiny bit of play. Not much, but it's there. So what do we do if that happens? Do we just chuck it away? No, we do not. What we do is we plane a little tiny flat on that corner, drill a pilot hole, and install a little brass screw. And so now we can adjust that screw to take up the slack. And so now when it goes in, perfect. Absolutely perfect. Now, as you can see, this sits lower than the table at the moment, so we have to raise it up. And there are two ways we can approach that. We can either drill and tap the saw itself. It's cast iron, so possible to do that. But what I prefer to do, because I'm a woodworker rather than a metal worker, is simply to install some screws on the underside, like I've done on this. And you'll have to see where your particular lugs are, because mine are different shapes at different corners. But if you get it right, then they will sit nicely on the pads. You can adjust them out and get it flush with the top of the saw. So let's go and do that. When you pilot the holes, you have to get them the right size, because this corner where the fillet's glued in is actually quite vulnerable. And it's the easiest thing in the world to split it if your screw is a bit tight. I've found that out the hard way before now. So a generous pilot hole, because it only has to hold, it's not taking any stress or anything, is it? It's just acting as a little spacer. Never throw away your old candle stubs. I've got a drawer full of them over there. Okay, let's see how that fits. Oh, that's a bit low. That's perfect. And these two are a bit high. That one's very high. So that can go in a bit more. That's good. So this is high. and that's low. That wants to come out a wee bit. That feels very nice to me, actually. That feels good. Excellent. So, we know that it fits. We've now got to make it zero clearance for that blade where it matters, which is at the cutting edge. So I'll get set up for that and I'll see you in a minute. I've got my throat plate in with no play, and it's time to bring the blade up through. Now this is potentially risky because the blade is pushing up on the throat plate from the underside, and we don't want it to lift it out. And also there's the issue of what happens if the riving knife catches, and that can happen. So what I like to do is just ease this inside edge underneath. Just a little bit. Just put a little bit of a chamfer on there so that the riving knife go on. So that the riving knife can't catch. So we need to hold it down, and I'm going to do that by moving the fence up to within just a couple of millimetres of the line there, and I'm going to use my push stick to hold down this side. So fingers crossed. And so now this is zero clearance at this front end, on both sides and across the kerf itself, right at the very end. And if I continue to raise the blade in a cut, then it will stay zero clearance on all those three lines. As soon as I drop the blade a bit, it stays zero clearance at the sides, but it's no longer zero clearance at the front. And that may or may not matter depending on what it is I'm doing. So let's see how much better this is with a zero clearance plate, throat plate, than it was with the regular steel one that came with it. How's that? Oh, plenty. And again, it looks fine on the top, which is what you'd expect because the blade's coming down. But have a look at the difference on the underside. It's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better. A heck of a lot better. And that's the same blade, and it's not even a blade specifically designed for chipboard, actually. That's just a regular rip crosscut combo blade, actually. So there you are. That's the way that I make my zero clearance inserts. Make some today. You'll have safer cuts and cleaner cuts. Thank you very much for watching. Until the next time, enjoy your workshop. Cheerio.